как ни странно, я удивительно, не думаю, что мой доклад это как ответ на доклад Петровича, частично, может быть. Я за... О, вы же... Это шрифт. Совсем чужой.
У нас такая же проблема. Windows 8.
Я прошу прощения заранее, я не буду читать свой доклад на русском языке, потому что я просто... Я не до этого. Но я буду на английском языке и очень медленно читать. И потом могу, конечно, отвечать на вопросы на русском языке. И все как-то готово на английском. И звучит так хорошо, что мне просто надо читать. Ну ладно. Вот видно, да, что... Okay, time. All right. Очень медленно. So, as a preface, I want to say that this is a concept paper. It's not a research paper. So this is not yet based on extensive research. But what I want to do is to describe and propose a framework for the anthropology of the North and Siberia. And I'm trying to decide if it's worth working this up as a research paper. So I'd be very grateful for feedback and suggestions for how to follow this up. So the ideas that I'm presenting here are rooted in my own experience of doing anthropology in the Russian far north, in Chukotka, in the 1990s, just as Russia was being targeted as a recipient of international development assistance, and it was being shaped by foreign development agendas. And I watched as foreign development agencies became active in the Russian north, mainly focusing on indigenous people. And in fact, I think it's interesting that Russia is the only part of the Arctic that was and is still targeted with international development assistance. So one of the reasons that you may have noticed, I haven't been around, one of the reasons I moved away from my focus on the north was my own personal dissatisfaction with the predominant frameworks that I perceived. Indigenous peoples tended to be treated as bearers of ecological knowledge and as if they wanted only to pursue their own traditional way of life, whereas I was increasingly coming to see them as political and economic actors that were frustrated by their marginalization. So in my own search for frameworks that made more sense to me, I gravitated to, in some ways back to, the anthropology of development. So Anthropology of Development. So there's this framework that I'm proposing for consideration. And I know that it's interesting, this roundtable is meant to examine the predominant concepts that exist in Russian and Euro-American anthropology. And so with apologies to David and Dima, what I'm going to do is look at concepts that have been absent and that remain absent. So specifically, I want to talk about the absence of an anthropology of development in the anthropology of the North and Siberia. That word development can be very slippery. So I want to clarify that what I mean by anthropology of development is studies of grand attempts by members of one society to intervene and improve the lot of people in another society. And it's not the topic of development that's missing in the anthropological literature on the North. In fact, the topic of development itself is very prevalent as a topic of concern and discussion. But what I think is absent is critical theorization of development by anthropologists of the North. That is, the anthropology of development as a framework, as a project, is missing. Now, I'm not going to propose that this framework ought to be adopted wholesale into the anthropology of the North. I'm not saying that everybody has to do this. I'm just trying to open things up a little bit and introduce an alternative perspective. Right. So, right. So the roundtable abstract talks about regionalization of knowledge, right? Regionalizacja znania. And I would argue that there's a clear regionalization of knowledge in regard to anthropology of development. But here I'm not primarily talking about Euro-American anthropology versus Russian ethnography. In this case, I actually think that North American and European and Russian and Japanese anthropologists of the North have more in common with one another than any of them has in common with the rest of anthropology when it comes to development. James Ferguson, he wrote what's now a classic ethnography called The Anti-Politics Machine about development in Lesotho. And he wrote that development haunts the house of anthropology. So I guess what I'm saying is it does not haunt the house of the anthropology of the North. Studies in the North that do address development tend to be very critical about the negative effects of development and the disempowerment of indigenous peoples that are caught in the path of development. But it seems that they take development as given. Like development arrives and then it has to be dealt with. And the anthropologist often serves as an advocate to help indigenous peoples with this struggle. And there are lots of examples of that kind of work, not only in the anthropology of the North. I think that's common across all regions. And when development comes into the picture, the focus tends to be on the destructive power of big industrial development projects, so dams and oil exploration and mining. The other kind of development, the seemingly positive development assistance, I think that would have been talked about in Peter's, in your presentation, the Arctic Development Report, Human Development Report, for example. So this kind of positive development tends to be overlooked, although I would argue that this can also be quite negative in its own way, in a more subtle way. And I'm not saying that there's something wrong with these kinds of approaches to development. So I'm not critiquing what's present. I think that's okay. I'm pointing out to what's absent. So that what's missing is a critical engagement with the development apparatus itself. And that apparatus is the source of both the big destructive development projects as well as the seemingly positive and supportive development assistance. Now, I'm not proposing that I can explain why this absence exists. I'm just posing it as a question. Why is there this absence? And this is where I think it links up with Peter's presentation a bit. So for what I want to do in the rest of the presentation is just to, I'm really short on time. When should I stop?
Well, 15 minutes would be nice, yeah. Another 5 minutes,
Another 5 minutes, okay. Well, then I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. Yeah. So I'm going to make six propositions, and I'll state them in fairly strong terms, just in order to be provocative, so that they can be debated if we want to do that. So proposition 1, there was no post-colonial moment in the Arctic, or that moment is perceived as long in the past. So therefore, anthropology of the North is weakly affected by post-colonial consciousness. Now, Euro-American anthropology went through a very strongly reflexive and self-critical period in the mid to late 20th century as colonial powers withdrew from Africa and Asia. And so there's a post-colonial consciousness that permeates Euro-American anthropology. But there's never been a post-colonial moment in the Arctic. All regions of the Arctic are contained within states that permanently claim them as part of their sovereign territory. So the post-colonial consciousness tends to be attenuated in the anthropology of the North. Now there's an interesting Soviet twist on this, because here the post-colonial period is already long in the past. It happened in the early 20th century. In a statement that I think is fairly typical of Soviet-era discourse, Gurevich writes that, I'm sorry, it's an English version of it. Colonial living conditions were the reason for the unchangeable backwardness of the northeastern people. The Great October Socialist Revolution had set the peoples of northeastern Siberia free from colonial pressure, and the Soviet state gave great material aid to these people, which did away with starvation. Right? So, but unlike Euro-American anthropology, anthropologists, Soviet anthropologists, completely separated themselves from that colonial period. They did not see themselves as implicated in it, and quite the contrary. They were part of fixing the mess that was left behind by that colonial period. So consequently, there were plenty of Soviet-era anthropological pieces discussing development of the North, and these pieces are entirely uncritical. Development of the peoples of the North is a good thing, and the very work of an anthropologist is to facilitate it. So even as many, not all, but many Euro-American anthropologists in the 1970s were critiquing modernization theory that seems to universally undergird all development efforts, including in the Soviet Union, Soviet anthropologists were actually applying modernization theory. Okay, proposition 2. Because there's no post-colonial consciousness in the Arctic, in practical terms, the anthropology of the North today resembles, for example, the anthropology of sub-Saharan Africa in the 1950s. What I mean by that is that anthropologists of the North, working inside their own countries or in friendly other countries, have privileged access to field sites, just as colonial-era anthropologists in sub-Saharan Africa had privileged access to field sites when they were endorsed by the colonial power. When colonial powers were forced out of places where the anthropologists worked, this forced anthropologists into a different position vis-a-vis their field sites, and it triggered a reflexive self-examination. And as a result of this, for example, anthropology was famously described as the handmaiden of colonialism. And this was a very painful experience for anthropologists, but ultimately it was theoretically very enriching to the discipline. Because the occupying and civilizing powers in the Arctic are not colonial, but are resident and internal to the state borders, there will not be a literal post-colonial moment in the Arctic. So the colonization is, in effect, permanent. And consequently, because anthropologists of the North are not so directly challenged by a post-colonial critique, not directly, they're a little bit less self-reflexive about their own position and their privileged access to field sites. And I think this is true across the North. So US, Canadian, Scandinavian, Russian, Japanese anthropologists can study northern populations in their own backyards, so to speak. Now, anthropologists of the North have been challenged by an indigenous self-determination critique. And there's been a movement among indigenous groups to limit the access of researchers to their communities. But non-native researchers still get to access field sites as privileged emissaries of the dominant power. And going through a process of community approval by a local council of elders is not the same thing as being made to obtain a visa from a sovereign foreign state government and pass through border control. That's what I'm talking about. So it's in this sense that the Arctic is the global South, sort of seen through the looking glass. And there's no mechanism, except for indigenous self-determination, there's no mechanism to force the gaze to be turned back onto anthropologists. And in this self-determination issue, anthropologists of the North have often styled themselves as advocates of indigenous peoples. So they're able to avoid the gaze of the other by standing right next to them. And because of this, it sometimes seems as though anthropologists of the North, and like Peter, this is critiquing my own work as much as anybody else. Anthropologists of the North have had a blind spot regarding their own impact on the local communities that they study. Okay, proposition 3, 13 minutes, okay. Just as there is no post-colonial critique, there's also no post-development critique in the anthropology of the North. What followed colonialism in the Third World was donor-driven development assistance. And in many anthropological accounts, development is nothing new. It's just a continuation of similar processes of intervention under a different guise. So colonialism to development is actually just one long process. One of the most prominent and contentious anthropologists who engage in the critique of development is Arturo Escobar. And he's been critiqued for focusing too much on discourse. And he's been displaced by anthropologists who are engaging in much more ethnographically rich studies of development practices rather than just the discourses. However, Escobar's critique is nonetheless one of the most referenced, whether it's by supporters or detractors, and it has strong theoretical impact in anthropology. But this post-development critique appears not to have taken root in the anthropology of the North. So the critique that Escobar lobbed against development anthropology, and what he meant by development anthropology is anthropologists who practice development themselves. He said, so it seems that that critique still applies over 20 years later to the anthropology of the North. And so something he said was, development anthropology, for all its claim to relevance to local problems, to cultural sensitivity, and to access to interpretive, holistic methods, has done no more than to recycle and dress in more localized fabrics the discourses of modernization and development. So that's Escobar being very critical. There are more sensitive voices than Escobar's that are more ethnographically informed, but they share pretty much the same message. I'm going to very quickly just show the last three propositions because I see that I don't have time to really go into them in detail. So the fourth proposition is that the Arctic is the only region that is off limits to international development projects, except in Russia. So in other words, the development is happening inside the countries, but for some reason, Russia, it's okay for everybody else to develop Russia's north, right? I'm going to skip over that very quickly. Proposition 5 is that Russian anthropologists of any sort, not just of the north, need to get moving on the anthropology of development. And here's why. In the Soviet period, anthropological critique of the Soviet Union's development activities inside or outside of the USSR was not possible. And quite to the contrary, Soviet anthropologists were among the promoters of development, especially among peoples of the North. Then international development projects coming out of Russia were effectively ended in 1991. And so for a generation, there's been nothing to critique. But now, the Russian government is creating a new aid program. And Russia will now be out there alongside other national development agencies. And this is what I'm studying now. This is happening in the context of a moment when development discourse is being turned on its head by the phenomenon of the so-called emerging donors, when Brazil and China and India, and yes, even Russia, are receiving a lot of attention as supposedly new agents of international development cooperation. And the field of development studies is in the process of being invented in Russia. And before long, this will become a field with scholarly authority that will dominate discourse about development in Russia. Now, anthropologists have always been involved in development, whether as advocates or as critics, and they've always played a very important role. So in Russia today, they're simply missing the boat as critics of development. They should be following what Russia is doing in the developing world. And just as evidence for the fact that there's a need for Russian anthropologists to do this is the fact that I was just invited to a United Nations seminar in Peking to make a presentation about Russia's development assistance program. And I was alongside a Chinese scholar talking about China, a Korean scholar talking about Korea, and a Japanese scholar talking about Japan. And there should have been a Russian anthropologist there talking about it. And just the last proposition is that I think all anthropologists of the North anywhere also need to get moving on the anthropology of development for similar reasons. And I'll end on that, and I realize that I've forfeited my time for questions. Я прошу прощения.
Вопросы, если какие-то есть?
Комментарий, наверное, маленький, небольшой, если позволите. Ну, во-первых, здравствуй. Я тебя люблю и ценю. Вот. Но все равно, вот, как-то думаю, у вас по верхам все идет.
Да, конечно.
Опять то же самое, вот, этнический туризм идет.
Хорошо, да.
Вот.
Ваш вопрос.
И поэтому не вопрос, а предложение. В смысле, не выйти замуж, потому что я 28 лет женат. Вот. У меня такое предложение. А съездим со мной в Сибирь потеть. В Сибирь съездим.
Хорошо. Хорошо, спасибо большое за предложение.
Да.
Спасибо. Спасибо.
Уже слишком много времени провела в себе.
Нет, ты по верхам провела, ты по городам, а мы поедем в нормальные вот эти поселения.
Хорошо, надо еще
Надо.
год жить. Я уже...
Тем более со мной.
Такое предложение ужасно.
Почему ужасно?
Антропология развития, кстати.